There's a lot of online chess events currently going on, and one of them is the Speed Chess Championship hosted on chess.com. Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru Nakamura are both part of it, and today they took on the Russian Vlads, not Chads, but close enough, in the quarterfinals. They were in separate matchups. Magnus Carlsen was up against Vladislav Artemiev, and Hikaru was up against Vladimir Fedoseev. I've picked out some moments from both matches to share with you. Obviously, there are dozens of games, but I know you like the recap videos that I make, so we'll go through each match, starting with Magnus versus Artemiev. The format, 90 minutes of 5+1 blitz, 60 minutes of 3+1 blitz, +1 meaning 1 second bonus per move, and 30 minutes at the end of 1+1 bullet. Not much else to say. All right, let's go. First game between Magnus Carlsen and Artemiev was a Caro Kann with Queen C7, a move that I've never seen. Yeah, not much else. It's obviously completely fine for black, but it's still a very strange move. Really, the most interesting moment came right when both players castled. Like, literally, right on this move, castles. Now, first thing we look at is... only thing that's been traded here is one piece, so black doesn't have a light squared bishop, white doesn't have one of their knights. And with short castling, with long castling positions on the same side, play is going to be really difficult to find for going an attack directly on your opponent. And that's why Magnus, a few moves into this middle game, sacrifices a knight. And he does this for 3 pawns. Okay, so he gets 3 pawns for the piece. In these kinds of positions, if you are up the piece, you need to make sure your opponent's pawns don't mobilize. Magnus's extra pawns are on this side of the board. He has a 3-on-1. On the other side, he has a 3-on-2, but these pawns aren't going to be pushed because his king is there. So watch what Artemiev does. He completely shuts down the movement of these pawns by planting his pieces right in front of them. That makes Magnus bail out into a queen trade. And then he just continues to pressure these, like, neither of these pawns can move, and he looks for the trade of the knight for the bishop. Then he brings the king, then he brings the rook, he plants it on g3, very nice square for the rook. A short while later, we have him taking on g2 and the first trade. This is really good. The guy with the 2 pieces wants to simplify the material. And then another thing gets traded. Now, a draw here is achievable if you get to rook versus rook and knight. Knight and rook. I highlighted them backwards. That's what you want. Artemiev, though, finds a really nice way to not let that happen. First things first, he cuts off Magnus's king. He slowly but surely ensures that this pawn isn't able to move forward. He wins it, and he maintains the ownership of 1 pawn. So you'll notice that first, he uses this pawn as a decoy. He brings this in here. I'll fast forward shortly, and you'll see him win the pawn on h6. I did promise that was going to happen. And he ends up in a position where he has 1 pawn remaining. Very important to do that. Don't just rush and take the pawns. You have to cut the king off, make sure the defending side has a very passive king. He gets the pawn, and now the pawn and the knight are very solid. Notice that the knight and the rook were counterattacked, and this is easily winning. And on move 75 of this game, this very, very first game, Magnus Carlsen resigned, and Artemiev took a 1-0 lead, something that we wouldn't potentially expect as a first game. So we go to the second game. Can Artemiev build on this lead? Well, Magnus Carlsen has the black pieces this time. He goes for g6, g3, and c6, looking for d5. He gets his desired move. Artemiev has a very interesting opening repertoire. He plays very flexible stuff, a lot of b3, a lot of b3, bishop b2 stuff. But he also mixes it up and doesn't always put the bishop on kind of the traditional square, instead putting it on a3. Players were very, very solid in this game. But Magnus started to create some conflict right when he played the move c5. And we have a lot of tension here. You can't actually take this because of the pin. Queen b5, take, queen c6, inviting a trade. And Artemiev invades with his rook. Very rare you can go all the way down the board with the rook. But after the dust settled and a lot of trades occurred, Magnus basically just offered Artemiev a trade of rooks. He just said, look, this is going to be a draw. Artemiev said no, I'm going to keep my pieces on the board. So Magnus said, all right, that's fine. Get out. Get out. And now, all of a sudden, it's not so easy to defend this pawn, because when you play rook b4, you are glued to the defense of this pawn, and I can move in my rook to either of these files. And that's an issue. Magnus plays rook c8, rook c1, f6. The knight jumps in. Artemiev continues to look for this b6 pawn, but Magnus defends everything. And here Artemiev played one of the strangest moves I've ever seen. He played knight b8, knight d6, and rook a8, looking for a discovered attack on the king. And Magnus just played rook here. And this is completely lost for Artemiev. I mean, Artemiev literally threw this game away by awkwardly coordinating his pieces. I mean, I just don't understand exactly what the logic was here. Because now he can't move his knight or his rook. And so a few moves later, he had to just resign here because he just can't move a single piece. He can't move his knight, he can't move his rook. A very strange game, and now Magnus is back in the game. The third game of the 5+1 was drawn, so we go to the fourth game. And the fourth game, we got more of the same. Very solid development from both sides. Artemiev going for his patented weird kind of opening stuff. Now it's a structure for black known as the hedgehog structure, the little spiky animal. And Artemiev demonstrates how to play against it. So the c4 pawn is not ever hanging because there's a rook here. And so something like queen c4 would be punishable with the move knight d5. You could take the knight, but then you lose your queen. If you move your queen, I take the bishop. So in the hedgehog structure, what you want to do is take as much space as possible. Literally, Artemiev does that with every pawn he has, and then goes for this very belligerent, aggressive attack on Magnus's king. After knight e5, take, we get bishop h3. Nobody can guard this pawn. Not a single one of black's pieces can protect the e6 pawn. And even though Magnus is able to create counterplay, Artemiev's king is completely safe. Pieces fly off the board here. And when the dust settles, Artemiev is just a clear piece up. And Magnus resigns again. Very strange stuff. So now, let's see if Artemiev can grow this lead. So Magnus begins the next game with d4. Magnus has the white pieces now. We get a Slav defense. And this line in the Slav where you go for the bishop early. You go for knight versus the two bishop position. Magnus just goes directly for the two bishops, develops, and castles queenside. Artemiev also castles queenside. We already saw this once, both sides castling this way. So Magnus begins to take space. Very instructive moment here, removing his opponent's key central pawn breaks. Artemiev has difficulty here maneuvering in a position where he doesn't have a lot of space. And then Magnus pushes forward, but gives away the d5 square. You'll notice that in this position, his pawn did a very good job protecting this. But later in the game, this square on d5 becomes in use. Notice how Artemiev trades off bishop for knight. Magnus now has a dark squared bishop and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 dark squared pawns. That means that Magnus's dark squared bishop is his bad bishop. It's running directly into all of his pawns. So g5, a breakthrough on that side of the board, bishop b4 and queen d8. A trade, and Artemiev hides his king, but now we begin the reroute. And this is the issue for the guy who's playing against the knights, is that the knights are so powerful. Knight e8 hits the bishop, and later in this game, Magnus lost the pawn on h4, trying to counterbalance that with the fact that he has an open f file, but he's not quite able to get away with it. And Artemiev just comes back and defends his pawn. Then, a few moves later, Artemiev finds a beautiful resource. Bishop f8, knight ef6. Counter-attacking the bishop. And this, like a move that isn't possible normally, but now is. Magnus doesn't go taking the knight and losing his bishop. And now Artemiev's knight is activated. It's in the center of the board. It's threatening knight d2, king a2, knight d6, ed6, and queen b8, trying to pick up this pawn without losing the pawn on f7. So Magnus is in big trouble. He's about to go down 2 games. He goes queen h7, take, knight e7, bishop c4, queen takes d4. Artemiev's logic is that after queen e7, there's queen c4, but Vladislav Artemiev blunders. In this position, it's a very cool technique, a little boomerang technique. Go up, then come back. In this position, you want to take the knight, but you also want it to be check. So how do you do that? Of course, you play queen e8. That's what Artemiev missed. forcing the king out, and now queen takes e7, and Magnus Carlsen is just up a bishop, and he is in the clear, and the game goes on for a little bit longer, but Magnus completely saved the entire time and gets Artemiev in a checkmate net, and then wins the pawn on c2. Artemiev's king was very close to getting checkmated. Magnus takes the way out by winning the pawn, and Magnus strikes back again. Artemiev cannot build on this lead. The next game of the match comes in the 3-1 segment. So I'm going to tell you how this segment finished, 5-1. Magnus won the remaining 2 games, and he was up 5-3 after the 5-1. They drew their first 2 games of 3+1. This next game is their 3rd game now of the 3+1 segment. And we're going to pick the game up in the middle because there's a lot of games to show. Here it's completely equal. Magnus with the white pieces plays the move. Oh, sorry, black plays knight d6, knight c5. So Magnus trades, and Artemiev here is down a pawn, but he's got some active prospects on the queen side with his 2 rooks. But Magnus allows this knight jump with some various pressure and threats, like on d2 with a fork, e3, plays rook c1, hangs his pawn, plays d6, and hangs a fork. And all of a sudden, Magnus is just down a knight, but he fights back. Magnus fights back. Remember what I told you in that first game? Rook and knight, invest in the outside pass pawn. So important to have an outside pass pawn when most of the action is happening on one side of the board, because that pawn will be a decoy. And as the pieces shuffled around, Magnus found a really annoying coordination here. Again, an X-ray of knight and rook, and it's impossible for Artemiev to move, who trades the rooks into a knight endgame. This should be winning for black, but it's difficult. The problem is there's no way to get these pawns, and you need to maintain at least one of these pawns on the board to win for black, because you can't win with king and knight. So, but the problem is that Artemiev can't leave, this knight can't leave the queen side, or else the a pawn will run. So it seemed like Magnus was actually making very good progress. But then Artemiev found a way. First thing he did is he centralized his king in opposite of this one. Magnus pushed the pawn, but after king d5, it's suddenly, uh-oh. And in that time, it's going to be impossible for the white king to cross the middle line. The knight covers both entrance squares. The pawn covers this one, and the pawn covers this. So what does Magnus do? He goes, all right, I got to go trade the g-pawn. The problem is that here after fg, hg, h4, it's over. Magnus resigned. The problem, if you go king e4 to try to go king f5, I just push. Here and here, and you can't get through. If you go attack my knight, I promote. If you do nothing, I take, I bring my king back, not there because it's illegal, but in this area, and then I'm gonna win the game. A lot of instructive endgame moments here, creating the outside pass pawn, how to win this knight versus, pawn endgame. And at this point in the match, the score is 6-5. The score is 6-5 between Magnus Carlsen and Vladislav Artemiev. But things begin to go wrong here, and Magnus begins winning many games in a row. In many of them, swindling the absolute, just swindling the hell out of Artemiev. One game in particular where that happened was this one. This was an epic game. Artemiev had the white pieces. This is the second to last 3+1 game, I believe. And we'll go all the way to a few moves before move 30, when Magnus blunders the move knight takes e5. He blunders knight e5, his queen's under attack, this is hanging, and he has to sacrifice his queen. Now, a good kind of instructive moment of how to play positions like this, where you have queen for rook and knight, or a queen for rook and bishop, and there's lots of pawns, you have to activate your queen to its maximum ability, and you need to create some sort of pass pawn imbalance. And that's exactly what Artemiev does. He activates the queen, and he creates a pass pawn. Artemiev is completely winning, but Magnus begins fighting back. He consolidates, he sacrifices a pass pawn. Sorry, he sacrifices his pawn to create counterplay on the other side of the board, and gets in his rook. He then hunts down some of Artemiev's pawns, while his pawns are just completely collapsing. In doing so, his knight is maintaining defense of the promotion square, until Artemiev finds this nice breakthrough g5. He then pushes his pawn all the way and gets an endgame of queen for knight and 2 pawns. But in a time trouble, Magnus was able to coordinate his last 4 pieces so well that Artemiev blundered his queen. His queen just got trapped. He sacrifices his queen and promotes his own queen. Queen and knight versus queen is a draw. Unless, a few moves down the line, you accidentally blunder your queen on f6. And it's over. The one knight of the endgame survived 2 queen promotions and a third one for you. Unbelievable. Just absolutely unbelievable. This was just one of the many games that Magnus was swindling Artemiev. And after both segments, it was 10-5. He had a 5-game lead. I only have one more game to show you because actually the bullet segment was won by Artemiev. He won more games than Magnus. One nice game that he won was this one, which is an instructive game of how to deal with a person attacking you and attacking on the other side of the board. This was a b3 system where Magnus got aggressive very early. You know, he didn't even wait to castle. He started an attack kind of immediately for the cost of 1 pawn. You'll notice that he gives away a pawn in the center and he castles queenside. So watch what Artemiev does. He doesn't weaken his king by pushing any of these pawns because that would allow black to trade the h-pawn and open the rook. He rotates back and he brings the knight to a nice square f4 and plays d4. Now, his next phase of the game will be to push his own pawns. You know, see, Magnus is digging, digging, digging. Now Magnus has the 2 pawns coming, but Artemiev is anticipating this, and here does something very instructive and plays the move h3. He does not trade to open any of the lines. He plays h3, queen g5, and takes on a6. This allows him to completely chop away at Magnus's defenses, at the same time maintaining defense over here. And you say, well, Levy, what if Magnus had played the move queen g3 here, for example, creating mate? Well, then I'm going to take, and this is the issue. If, let's say, he plays rook here, I now disconnect the queen and the bishop by playing the move knight f4. The queen can only deliver mate as long as this is defending. This blocks the defense, and here there will be nothing. And it's actually, of course, black who's getting mated. So that's what happened in the game. I mean, not quite checkmate, but he solidified the center with the knights, and he just turned the tables on Magnus. And that was all. He trades off both bishops with checks, sacrifices back the knight, but brings his second rook, and now the game is completely lost. And in this position, there was resignation, because rook b8 is unstoppable. A very instructive game. One of the nice games that Artemiev won throughout this match, but unfortunately not enough. There was nothing to be done. Magnus Carlsen victorious overall. The final score being, I believe he got 13.5 points at the end. But I could be mistaken. That could be just completely incorrect. But it's okay because I have a graphic at the end that I'll show you. So stay tuned. The second match of the day was Hikaru versus Vladimir Fedoseev. We'll start with this game. These two play a ton. They've played over 1,000 games. Hikaru usually wins about 62 to 63% of them. So let's see what happens. Hikaru begins with d4 and plays into a queen's gambit semi-Slav defense with bishop g5. This game is going to teach you guys a lot of positional concepts because he trades off the bishop early, e3, knight d7, and really kind of the most important position is in the, let's say this, once both players have castled. Hikaru puts his rooks on c1 and d1. You say, why there? It's a $1 million question. Where do you put your rooks once they're connected? So bishop b7, and now Hikaru plays a nice positional concept. What would you play in this position? What looks like the most natural way to make progress with the white pieces? If you're saying the move bishop to a6, then you are correct. This trades off an important defender of the light squares for the black, kind of the black structure. This c6 pawn is a bit weak, and Hikaru immediately goes after it by stockpiling on the c file. We get knight f6, knight fd2, a trade, queen goes all the way to a6. So like I said, the light squares are weak. And here Hikaru finds a nice idea, again, sacrificing the queen for the two rooks. I always get this question. Levy, when do you do this? When do you want the queen? When do you want the two rooks? Look, you're not going to like the answer. The answer is it depends. It depends how well you can coordinate your pieces. Knight versus bishop in this position is a sufficient imbalance for you to get to an endgame that's nice for the guy with the two rooks. Why? Because notice what Hikaru does. This bishop becomes a target, and the rooks are able to invade on the back rank. Most important thing is to protect your pawn structure, right? We just saw a game where Artemiev had the queen versus the knight and the rook. Well, here we have a guy who's got two rooks rather than knight and rook. And the queen here is not able to do much. Because even though you get a pin like this, where the king can't move away from the knight, Hikaru makes an entrance on the 8th rank and just goes for the king. And the weakness is near the king. That's just what he's able to do. He wins a pawn, and Fedoseev fights back. Hikaru doesn't take. Brings his rooks, removes the defenders of some of the final pawns, and then says, all right, I'm back. I'm back for the piece right here. This is really what I'm after. And, well, in trying to defend himself, Fedoseev blunders a checkmate net with the move rook g7, the quiet killer, cutting off the king's escape squares, and rook h4. Very nice game from Hikaru. Much like the first match, there is an exciting second game, too. So in the second game of this match, it was Hikaru with the black pieces defending against the Catalan. One of the most solid openings. I recommend this for many intermediate players. Queen's Gambit with d4, c4, and this fianchetto on the queen side. Sorry, the king side. Now, a lot of this is mainline theory. We're not going to look at it in crazy depth, but already kind of an interesting position. You notice that Hikaru develops his knight this way because he has very nice control over the b4 square with the bishop, the pawn, and the knight. When Fedoseev plays a4, he doesn't ever have the option to go backwards with his pawn and defend the b4 square, which means that Hikaru can use it and put something there. He then trades off a bishop and plays rook d8, inviting some pretty nasty complications, which result in this position. If you look at the position, Big Fish is up a pawn, and he can take a pawn with check to be up 2 pawns. But bishop takes h7 is a losing mistake. You say, why? Well, opposite colored bishops benefit the person who's creating an attack on their opponent. And in this position, yes, you take a pawn with check, but now your coordination is dead. I'm threatening rook takes pawn, defended, attacking your queen, and opening the attack on the rook. So sometimes in chess, you can win something immediate, and then that completely kills your coordination. You completely lose the game because of the move, even though you take something, it's check, it must be good. Not always, because then there's just no way out, and that's exactly what happened in the game. Hikaru just won the exchange, played back to the b4 square, activated his second rook, and still this is a very instructive game on how to convert such an endgame. So, puts his king on g7, light squares are going to be kind of the thing you need to worry about with the light squared bishop. He hides his king on g7, very safe, and the queen trade here benefits him. He begins expanding. He takes more space. This is how you make progress in an endgame. Take space, bring your king, bring the second rook down. It's very much like the last game, offering a trade of rooks, trying to get 2 rooks on the back rank. 2 games in a row now, right? Trade, rooks go on the back rank, and the rooks just invade. I mean, take some space and invade with the 2 rooks, and, you know, you'll be beating 29.99 level players in no time. Rook a2, and the game is over because you have to defend the bishop. If king g1, rook a1, boom, GG. So he takes a 2-0 lead. And there was more of the same. I'm going to now show you their final game of the 5+1 section. This one was a crazy game. Again, this is one of the ways you become a super GM, rockstar, beast, demolition, whatever, other words to describe dominance. Hikaru plays kind of something he's been playing a lot. And I guess right here is really where I'll kind of start showing the position in its entirety. Fedoseev gets a position from the middle game where he's slightly better. He's got the 2 bishops. They're not that powerful yet, but he has a very clear target, and he just begins to improve his position methodically. Goes here, trades off Hikaru's bishop. chops down the knight in the center, leaving Hikaru with just a dreadful pawn on e6. Plays queen takes a5, brings the queen back, and starts to make progress now down the middle. They get into an endgame, which is queen rook in 6 versus queen rook in 5. It's so dreadful to defend this position with the black pieces. White can play this position forever. But what does Hikaru do? He just sits there. He says, all right, come bring it. I'm going to create counterplay down the only side of the board that I can, which is the C file. And notice, I am not going to take and give you control of the C file. I'm going to trade on my terms. The counterplay in endgames often is down open files. So he makes him take and is able to invade with the queen. 3 games now, we're learning about this active piece play and back rank invasion. And Fedoseev at some point goes for a breakthrough on a5, thinking, if you take me here and I move out of the way, you can't trade queens because I'm just going to promote. I'm too fast. But there is a sequence of checks here that results in the loss of the a5 pawn. Hikaru finds a way to check and win the a5 pawn. Now he's the guy up a pawn, and then he's able to re-invade with the queen and bring his king. Now watch what the king does. It doesn't take any pawns. It goes behind the pawns using the enemy pawns as a shield. And in this position, Fedoseev resigns because the queen has no way to attack the king. And he's threatening check and all sorts of different mating nets. So this game is just over because there's no way for white to get back and defend against losing all the pawns and potentially getting mated. I'm just going to say this. The first 9 games of the match between Hikaru and Fedoseev went to Hikaru. Hikaru was up 9-0 and was about to adopt Fedoseev 10 games straight. The game I'm going to show you, well, we can actually fast forward. It was bad. Hikaru had bishop and 6 pawns versus knight and 4. Of course, if this pawn is on b6, these pawns are not doubled, or these pawns are at least together at the very least, it feels like you're actually up a lot of pawns, but because they're doubled and isolated, it doesn't quite feel that way. Now, the way you win this endgame is, well, you have to find a way to prevent the king from coming in and taking all your pawns. Like, you see, again, activity. In this case, the active king is the difference maker. And Hikaru, instead of moving away with the bishop, went for an endgame where he thought, okay, I'm up a pawn, I run my king, and that's it. I mean, I'm just too fast. But he miscounted. And Fedoseev was able to just by, just by like the tiniest stretch, play a move like f5, which if you take, you would lose. Because what happens is, I promote first. Look at this. I promote with check. Isn't that crazy? I would promote with check here. So Hikaru doesn't take, but instead that results in an endgame where it's queen and pawn versus queen, which is sometimes winning, but not in this case. And they shuffle, and Fedoseev draws a game after 10 games. We'll jump ahead to game 13 now, where the players begin with a King's Indian defense, obviously very popular, and the queens get traded, and we have a middle game which is like right around here. A lot of tension on the queen side, a lot of okay, I can't speak English. A lot of tension on the queen side. Long day of streaming and video making today. It's like 7 hours. Anyway, the queen side explodes, and it's Hikaru losing a central pawn. So Fedoseev has an extra pawn. Now Hikaru is trying to counterbalance this with very active pieces on the queen side. Knight b6, for example, bishop b6. Fedoseev very correctly goes to trade off pieces and makes this knight a little bit vulnerable. Knight c5 back. They trade everything, and he wins the b2 pawn. Now, under normal circumstances, you probably shouldn't be winning this because of how together everything is. But a few moves later, Hikaru, after rook d6, bishop e7, in this position should go for this check, king f7, and the move rook b6. The bishops are hanging, but now the rook is hanging and it's defended, so you can't take. Hikaru, instead of going for this, goes for rook d5, and forgets that after rook b5, he's losing material. That's it. So after this, he's just down material. He doesn't have a check. He doesn't have a capture because he would lose the rook on d5. And some moves later, Fedoseev went on to win this game and win his first game out of 13. It wasn't particularly close. After the second blitz segment was over, 5-1 and 3-1 both ended. Hikaru had a 14-3 lead over Fedoseev, and that didn't get much better over the course of bullet. I'm gonna show the final game. This one was a little bit of fun. It was a very chaotic opening, very cramped opening. And a position where, like, Hikaru really slow plays it with these pawns. But you'll notice how he begins to expand. So he expands his position by playing b4, meeting Fedoseev's queenside aggression with the pawns, and then later breaking with e4 and d4. Notice how he has 4 things defending a square before he makes that break, right? And then queen e6 and e5, f5. This now is leading the transition to the end game because this pawn is going to be protected and passed since it has no pawns in its way. If it has pieces in its way, it's still considered a passed pawn. You just have to get rid of the pieces. That's what Hikaru tries to do. So he sacrifices a pawn to get rook d6, double the rooks, bring the queen back, and just go forward with the pawn, right? We've seen throughout today's games, material doesn't mean everything if you can counterbalance it with activity. So bishop d5, king here, king comes forward. That's a bullet game, so it's not perfect. And now rook d8, looking to create havoc. The pawn is defending the rook. b4, bishop e6, trying to get the rook out. He goes for a rook trade, but he abandons his bishop. And what happens is, look at this. Bishop d7, shielding the bishop from the defense. And Fedoseev at some point has to sacrifice his bishop. Now, what do? You go into an endgame with 2 versus a bishop and 3-on-3 on the same side. Watch how Hikaru plays this. Trades the rook, brings the king to the center, and doesn't let the pawns move by bringing the bishop back. The bishop can shield the pawns, and notice he doesn't take. He wants a certain kind of pawn structure where the pawn on f5 is a target forever. If you can do that, isolating a pawn in the same color square as your bishop, that's how you win these kinds of endgames. The king is not able to do enough because what happens the second you abandon your pawn is you lose it. You bring the bishop back, you bring the pawn up, defended by the bishop, and this was the final move of the day. Fedoseev resigned, and Hikaru won his match. Now, I promised that I would show you a bracket at the end. That is exactly what we will do now. Here it is. So the semifinals will be Hikaru, a rematch versus Wesley So. They just played in the Skilling Open. Magnus Carlsen versus Maxim Vachilegrov. They have played many times against each other. MVL, I believe, is former world #1 in Blitz. He might have the highest Blitz rating of all time, according to FIDE. Not online, I mean over the board. Let me know what your predictions are. I'd love to see them in the comments. Yeah, listen, you guys like these recaps, right? So I'm going to try to make them for the Speed Chess Championship, the finals and the semifinals, and all other tournaments. So hope you enjoyed the video. See you in the next one.